The gangplank creaked under boots that would never touch dry land again. 11 men stood on a rust-streaked barge in the Mississippi Current, burlap sacks cinched over their heads, while the Donnelly brothers cut the running lights and let the darkness swallow everything but the sound of water slapping steel. This is the story of how a family of grain haulers turned a labor dispute into the deadliest night in street. Louis River commerce history using nothing but patience, concrete sample bags, and a carefully planned management retreat. The Donnelly and Sons yard sat 3 blocks from the Mississippi docks in South St. Louis, where diesel fumes mixed with the yeasty smell of grain dust and the river's perpetual rot. 1963. The air tasted like rust and broken promises. Every morning at 5:30 a.m., Thomas Donnelly Sr. watched his sons, Michael, James, and Patrick, load grain into international harvester trucks that coughed blue smoke and complained through every gear. The family had been hauling wheat, corn, and barley to the riverfront since 1947, back when a handshake meant something and dock scales told the truth. But truth had become expensive on the St. Louis waterfront. Before we dive deeper into what happened on that barge, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been buried in police files and union ledgers for over 60 years. The Donnelly trucks would roll onto the dock scales carrying 4 tons of grain. The needle would swing, the dock boss would scribble a weight ticket, and somehow every single time the official number came up light. 3 tons, 2.5 tons. Once, impossibly, just under 2 tons for a load, Thomas himself had watched them fill to the brim. The missing weight meant missing money. 10% light meant 10% of their pay vanished into someone else's pocket. Year after year, the Donnellys watched dock bosses trade their work boots for Italian leather. Rusted Chevrolets became gleaming Cadillacs, with white wall tires and chrome that caught the sun like a slap. The head weighmaster, Vincent Carbone, started wearing suits that cost more than the Donnellys cleared in a month. His deputy, Frank Mazzoli, bought a vacation house on the Merrimack River. The pattern was obvious to anyone willing to look. The Donnellys looked. They also started asking questions. Thomas Sr. approached the Teamsters Union local in May of 1963, bringing meticulous records, dates, loads, weight discrepancies calculated to the pound. The union rep, a thick-necked man named Donald Burke, listened with the careful attention of someone being paid not to care. Could be moisture content, Burke suggested, leaning back in his chair. Could be settling during transport. Could be you're not packing as tight as you think. Could be theft, Thomas replied. Could be fraud. Could be someone needs to calibrate those scales. Burke's expression didn't change. These are serious accusations against established businesses. You got proof beyond your own records? That's when young Sean Donnelly, Patrick's 23-year-old cousin who kept books for the family, decided to get proof. He spent 3 weeks watching the docks, noting which clerks handled which weight tickets, tracking where the paperwork went after trucks rolled off the scales. What he found turned suspicion into certainty. A clerk named Raymond Hollis was rerouting duplicate tickets to a shell company called Midwest Grain Reserves. The missing tonnage was being sold twice, once to the legitimate buyer, once to the phantom company. The dock bosses were skimming thousands of pounds per week, selling ghost grain that existed only on forged documents. Sean brought his findings to the family on June 14, 1963, spreading papers across the kitchen table in Thomas Sr.'s house. The evidence was irrefutable. The theft was systematic. The corruption ran from the scale operators through the weighmasters straight up to the dock superintendent. 2 days later, Sean's body was found, floating face down near the Eads Bridge, wallet missing, pockets empty except for river silt. The police report listed it as a probable mugging gone wrong. No witnesses, no suspects. Case filed and forgotten within a week. But the Donnellys knew better. They also knew the law wouldn't help them, not when the men they'd accuse had union protection, political connections, and police captains who owed favors. Some problems couldn't be solved with lawyers or ledgers. Some problems required a barge, a dark night, and 11 invitations to a meeting that only the Donnellys would survive. The question that haunted every conversation in the Donnelly kitchen after Sean's death wasn't whether to act. It was how completely and how soon. Because in South Street Lewis, 1963, you either accepted being robbed or you became something darker than the men robbing you. What would you do? Watching your life's work vanish into someone else's Cadillac while your cousin floated in the river. The Donnellys already knew their answer. They just needed to send the invitations. The typewriter keys struck paper with the rhythm of a funeral march, as Michael Donnelly composed 11 letters that read like peace offerings, but felt like death warrants. Understanding who died on that barge requires understanding how carefully the Donnellys chose each name, not in rage, but with the cold precision of accountants balancing books written in blood. Thomas Sr. didn't sleep the night they found Sean. He sat at the kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey he didn't drink and a yellow legal pad he filled with names. Not suspects, certainties. Men whose guilt was proven in Cadillac payments and Sean's river-soaked corpse. By dawn, he'd listed 14 names. By breakfast, the family had narrowed it to 11. Vincent Carbone topped the list. The head weighmaster controlled which trucks got random inspections that always found cause to dock weight. His signature appeared on every suspicious ticket. His handwriting, a study in practiced indifference. Below him, Frank Mazzoli, his deputy, who'd personally handled the scale the day Sean confronted Raymond Hollis about the duplicate tickets. Then Hollis himself, the clerk whose shell company scheme had cost Sean his life. The rest filled out the conspiracy, like supporting actors who'd earned their roles. Anthony Rizzo, the dock superintendent who ignored every complaint. James Kellerman and Robert Voss, scale operators who'd been skimming since the Eisenhower administration. 4 union officials, Donald Burke, Martin Kovach, Eddie Palmieri, and Theodore Walsh, who'd stonewalled every grievance the Donnellys filed. 2 grain inspectors, Samuel Morton and Dennis Clark, whose job was preventing exactly this kind of fraud, but who somehow never noticed trucks losing 20% of their weight between the yard and the dock. 11 men, 11 thieves, 11 targets. The Donnellys weren't impulsive people. Patrick spent 3 weeks studying barge rentals, river currents, and police patrol patterns along the Mississippi. James sourced concrete mix and burlap sacks from 3 different suppliers, so no single purchase would raise questions. Michael researched what mixture of alcohol and barbiturates would make men compliant. Without making them unconscious, they wanted their targets aware enough to understand what was happening, just not capable of fighting back. The cover story came together over Sunday dinner in late June. They'd host a labor management retreat on a chartered barge neutral territory, away from the docks where grievances had festered. Open bar, fishing equipment, a chance to clear the air and find common ground. The kind of corporate team-building nonsense that was becoming fashionable in 1963, when companies pretended conflict could be resolved with handshakes and honest conversation. The invitations went out on July 2nd. Michael had practiced Vincent Carbone's signature until he could forge it perfectly. Each letter appeared to come from the dock superintendent's office, formally requesting attendance at a mandatory conflict resolution session scheduled for July 19th. The barge would depart at 6 p.m., return by midnight. Attendance was strongly encouraged for anyone who wanted to continue working harmoniously on the Street Lewis waterfront. 11 invitations. 11 crimes masquerading as mediation. The responses came back within a week. 10 immediate acceptances, men who couldn't refuse what looked like an official summons from management. Only Raymond Hollis hesitated. He called the Donnelly yard on July 8th, asking if they'd received the same invitation. "Seems odd," he said, "calling a meeting on a barge instead of the Union Hall." Michael assured him it was legitimate. "Neutral territory," he explained. "No union, no management, just people talking. Besides, He let his voice carry just enough friendliness to hide the hate. "They're serving top-shelf bourbon, and the fish are supposedly biting." Hollis agreed. Greed and free liquor convinced him the same way it had convinced the others. The Donnellys spent the next week preparing the barge. They'd rented a 40-foot grain hauler from a company in Alton, Illinois, old enough to be cheap, sturdy enough to hold 11 men, and the weight that would sink them. Patrick installed railings that looked decorative, but were actually designed to funnel men toward a specific section of deck where the gangplank could be extended. James mixed concrete into 60-pound sample bags, the kind grain inspectors used for testing, and stored them below deck in waterproof containers. Michael stockpiled bottles of bourbon, vodka, and gin, along with enough Seconal to sedate a hospital ward. No one would pull this off alone. On July 18th, the night before the scheduled departure, the Donnelly brothers met at the yard. No whiskey this time. No toasts. Just 4 men looking at each other across the table where Sean had spread his evidence 5 weeks earlier. "Last chance to back out," Thomas Sr. said. Nobody moved. "Then we do this clean?" He continued. "No mistakes, no witnesses, no bodies washing up with our fingerprints. We're not killers, we're problem solvers. Remember that when it gets difficult." The problem was 11 men who'd stolen their livelihoods and murdered their cousin. The solution was already loaded onto a barge at the St. Louis riverfront, waiting for high tide and darkness to transform a labor dispute into the kind of disappearance that would haunt the Mississippi for decades. But first, 11 men had to board, and the Donnellys had to smile while welcoming them to their deaths. Vincent Carbone arrived early, stepping onto the gangplank in shoes that cost more than the Donnellys' monthly diesel budget, completely unaware he was walking toward his own execution. The Mississippi at dusk smelled like diesel exhaust and dead fish, the water thick as motor oil, under a sky turning the color of old bruises. The barge rocked gently against Pier 17, its deck strung with Chinese lanterns that gave the whole setup a festive appearance, almost cheerful if you didn't know what the Donnellys had hidden below deck. Thomas Sr. stood at the gangplank wearing a forced smile and a clean shirt, shaking hands with men he'd spent weeks planning to drown. "Glad you could make it, Vince," he said, gripping Carbone's palm with practiced firmness. "Bar's already open. Help yourself." Carbone surveyed the setup with the casual superiority of a man who'd never imagined himself as prey. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, a table loaded with bottles and ice, fishing rods leaning against the starboard rail. It looked exactly like what the invitation promised, a good-faith attempt at resolving conflict through conversation and alcohol. By 6:15 p.m., 9 of the 11 targets had arrived. They clustered near the bar, drinks already in hand, talking about baseball and the heat wave that had turned St. Louis into an oven. Frank Mazzoli wore a Hawaiian shirt that looked ridiculous on his thick frame. Donald Burke had brought cigars, passing them around like peace offerings. Raymond Hollis stood slightly apart, still uncomfortable, nursing a bourbon and watching the Donnellys with eyes that suggested some animal part of his brain understood the danger, even if his conscious mind dismissed it. The last 2 arrived at 6:28. Anthony Rizzo, the dock superintendent, showed up with Samuel Morton, one of the grain inspectors who'd been on the Donnelly payroll through deliberate blindness. They boarded together, laughing about something, their footsteps hollow on the gangplank. 11 men, all present, all accounted for. Michael Donnelly stood at the stern, watching Patrick untie the mooring lines with movements that looked casual but were timed to the second. James was already in the pilot house, hand on the throttle, waiting for the signal. The barge was registered to a shell company the Donnellys had created, using the same techniques Raymond Hollis had taught them: ghost paperwork, phantom owners, documents that would dissolve under investigation like sugar in river water. "Gentlemen," Thomas Sr. called out, raising a glass of what looked like whiskey but was actually iced tea. "Before we get started with the serious talk, how about we get out on the water? Better breeze out there, less dock smell, and the fish bite better once we're past the bridge." A few men exchanged glances, but nobody objected. Why would they? The invitation had mentioned fishing. The bourbon was good. The evening was warm. And they were union officials and dock bosses, the kind of men who never imagined themselves as victims. The engine coughed to life at 6:32 p.m. The barge pulled away from Pier 17 with 11 thieves aboard and 4 men who'd stopped thinking of themselves as honest. The first 20 minutes played out exactly as planned. The targets drank. They loosened ties and rolled up sleeves. Eddie Palmieri, one of the union officials, started telling a joke about a priest and a farmer. The Mississippi Current caught the barge and pulled it south, away from the populated waterfront, toward the industrial section where factories replaced homes and witnesses became scarce. Michael moved through the group, refilling drinks, his movement smooth as a bartender's, his smile never wavering. But the bourbon he poured came from bottles Patrick had doctored that afternoon, adding crushed saconol in ratios calculated by weight and tolerance. Not enough to knock them out, just enough to make them slow, compliant, confused. The sun dropped below the western bank at 7:03 p.m., painting the river the color of dried blood. By 7:15, Vincent Carbone was slurring his words. Frank Mazzoli had sat down heavily in a folding chair and seemed unable to stand. Raymond Hollis tried to walk to the rail and nearly fell, catching himself with the clumsy grab of someone whose limbs had stopped obeying commands. One by one, the targets realized something was wrong. Their coordination failing, their thoughts turning thick and slow as river mud. "I don't feel right," Donald Burke said, his voice distant and confused. What was in those drinks? Justice disguised as bourbon. Thomas Sr. didn't answer. Instead, he nodded to his sons. Patrick produced a lockbox from below deck and opened it to reveal 11 pistols, the personal weapons they'd asked each man to surrender, for safety reasons, when they'd boarded. The targets had complied, laughing about paranoid insurance requirements. Now those guns were locked away while their owners swayed on a deck that had become a floating prison. "We're going to have a different kind of conversation than you expected," Thomas said, his voice carrying over the engine's rumble. "About weight tickets, about missing grain, about my nephew Sean, who you murdered for asking questions you couldn't afford to answer." The barge was 3 miles south of the city now, approaching a stretch of river where the current ran deep and fast, where the bottom was soft silt that swallowed things and never gave them back. James cut the running lights. Darkness swallowed the barge like the river would soon swallow its passengers. Patrick emerged from below deck carrying the first of the concrete-filled sample bags. What happens when men who've spent their lives stealing from others finally face the bill? The Donnellys were about to provide an answer, measured in burlap sacks and river depth. Vincent Carbone was the first to understand he was going to die. His expensive shoes scraping deck boards as Patrick Donnelly tied 60 pounds of concrete to his belt with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. This wasn't execution, it was accounting, and every man would answer for exactly what he'd stolen before the river collected its due. The barge had anchored mid-channel at 7:41 p.m., engine silent, only the slap of current against steel breaking the darkness. No moon, no stars. Cloud cover had rolled in from the west, turning the night into the kind of black that swallows sound and hope in equal measure. The nearest lights were factory windows half a mile north, distant enough to be useless, close enough to mock the men who'd soon be screaming toward them. Thomas Sr. stood at the center of the deck, holding a battery-powered lantern that cast shadows longer than truth. The 11 targets sat or slumped in their folding chairs, arranged in a semicircle like a jury that would never reach a verdict. The seconal had done its work. They were conscious, but slow, aware but helpless, their bodies betraying them the way they'd betrayed every trucker who'd trusted their scales. "You're going to tell us exactly how much you stole," Thomas said, his voice flat as the river's surface. "Every dollar, every pound, every lie you wrote on weight tickets, while my family went hungry and my nephew went into this water for asking questions." Vincent Carbone tried to stand, but his legs folded. "You can't do this," he slurred. "You're not. This isn't." "We're not what?" Michael Donnelly interrupted, kneeling to cinch the concrete bags tighter around Carbone's waist. Killers? You're right. We're grain haulers. Honest men. But you made honest men obsolete on the St. Louis docks, so we're adapting. The gangplank extended from the port side like a tongue reaching toward oblivion. 8 feet long, 2 feet wide, no railings. It angled down to where the Mississippi waited, patient as debt. Patrick pulled a burlap sack over Carbone's head and tied it at the neck, not tight enough to suffocate, just enough to blind. "Walk," he said, guiding the weighmaster toward the plank's edge. "Tell us what you did, or walk silent. Either way, you walk." Carbone's confession spilled out in fragments, his words muffled by burlap and terror. 20%, he gasped. Sometimes 30. We'd record the real weight, then issue tickets showing less. The difference went to Midwest grain reserves. Burke set it up. Rizzo approved it. Everyone got a cut. Everyone. How long? Thomas asked. Since 58. Maybe 57. I don't. I can't remember exactly. 6 years. Maybe 7. Thousands of loads. Hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen from families who couldn't afford accountants or lawyers, who trusted that scales told truth, because what else could working men trust? And Sean? James Donnelly's voice cut through the darkness. What happened to my cousin? Silence. Then, Hollis called Mazzoli. Said the kid was asking too many questions. Had papers showing the duplicate tickets. Mazzoli talked to Burke. Burke talked to Carbone's voice broke. I didn't kill him. I swear to God I didn't put hands on him. But you knew. Thomas said. I knew. Guilty enough. Walk. Carbone's feet found the gangplank through muscle memory and seconal fog. 1 step. 2. The board flexed under his weight and the concretes. 3 steps. 4. He was crying now. The sound ugly and wet through the burlap. Please, he begged. I have a family. I have. So did we, Patrick said. So did Sean. 5 steps. 6. The river waited below, black and final. At 7 steps, Carbone stopped. Wouldn't move. Couldn't move. Fear had frozen him mid-plank, swaying in darkness, balanced between the deck he couldn't see and the water he could hear. Michael Donnelly solved the problem with a push not hard, just firm enough. The kind of push you'd give a stalled truck. Carbone didn't scream. The burlap sack stole his voice, or maybe the shock did. He hit the water with a sound like a door slamming in an empty house. The concrete pulled him under in seconds. The river erased him like a mistake. 1 down, 10 to go. A riverboat passed 200 yards east at 8:07 p.m., its lights sweeping across the water in golden arcs that never quite reached the barge. Someone on deck was playing music. Sinatra, maybe, or one of those smooth crooners who made the world sound gentler than it was. The barge crew would have seen a dark shape anchored mid-channel, unlighted, suspicious. They would have noted it in logs or mentioned it to captains. They kept moving south, music fading. Witnesses who chose not to witness. From the St. Louis Harbor Patrol log, July 19th, 1963. 8:15 p.m., reported dark vessel anchored illegally in main channel, southern industrial zone. Advised to investigate on return patrol. Weather conditions deteriorating. Postponed until 21st. Frank Mazzoli went second. He fought harder. The seconal hadn't hit him as thoroughly, or his bulk metabolized it faster. It took James and Patrick both to wrestle the concrete bags onto him, and when they pulled the burlap sack over his head, he thrashed like a caught fish, nearly knocking over the lantern. His confession was defiant. You think this changes anything? He spat. You think killing us makes you clean? You're murderers now. Same as us. No, Thomas Sr. said quietly. We're accountants. And your debt just came due. Mazzoli lasted 3 steps on the gangplank before the weight and the drugs betrayed his legs. He fell sideways, hit the water, the splash louder than Carbone's had been. The concrete did its work. The river erased another name. Raymond Hollis was weeping before they even approached him. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, rocking in his chair. "I'm so sorry about Sean. I didn't want," Burke said. "If I didn't help, they'd pin everything on me. I was scared. I was scared," Patrick repeated, tying the bags. "My cousin was scared too when you put him in this river." 11 men boarded the barge. 9 remained. The Donnellys worked with the methodical patience of farmers, harvesting crops. No rage, no hurry, just the steady progress of men completing necessary work. Between each drowning, they drank coffee from a thermos. Between confessions, they checked their watches, calculated current speeds, estimated how far downstream the bodies would travel before surfacing, if they surfaced. The Mississippi has swallowed better men than these. By 9:30 p.m., 6 chairs sat empty. 6 men had walked the gangplank, surrendered to concrete and current. The remaining 5 targets had stopped struggling, stopped pleading. Shock had settled over them like river fog. They waited their turns with the hollow-eyed acceptance of men who'd finally run out of options, connections, and time. But the Donnellys weren't finished with confessions. The last 5 men held the answers to questions that had haunted the family since Sean's body washed up. Who ordered the killing? Who carried it out? Who covered it up? The truth was coming, one weighted step at a time. Donald Burke screamed his confession before they even touched him, his voice cracking across the water like something already broken and begging to stay that way. The truth about who killed Sean Donnelly wasn't one answer. It was a conspiracy that reached higher and cut deeper than the family had imagined. By 10:02 p.m., the barge deck looked like an abandoned theater. Folding chairs scattered where bodies had been dragged from them. Lantern light catching pools of spilled bourbon and river spray. 5 men remained. 5 chances to learn which hands had actually closed around Sean's throat, which voices had given the order, which lies had been told to police who chose not to investigate too carefully. Burke sat shaking in his chair. The union official's usual confidence dissolved into something that looked like a child's terror. Patrick Donnelly crouched in front of him, holding the concrete bags, but not yet tying them. "You've got one chance to make this easier on yourself," Patrick said. "Tell us everything about Sean. Names, dates, who did what." The words tumbled out in a rush. Hollis panicked after the kid confronted him about the duplicate tickets. "Called me at home. Said Sean had documentation that would expose the whole operation. I told him to sit tight, that I'd handle it. But Mazzoli," Burke's voice caught. "Mazzoli got nervous. Said loose ends needed tying before this went federal. He brought in Eddie Palmieri and Theodore Walsh. They grabbed Sean outside his apartment on June 12th, late. Told him they just wanted to talk, wanted to work something out. And then?" James Donnelly's voice was ice. "They took him to the docks. Palmieri had brass knuckles. Walsh had, God help me, Walsh had a length of chain. They worked him over, trying to scare him into giving up the documents. But Sean wouldn't break, wouldn't tell them where he'd hidden the papers. So Palmieri," Burke stopped, swallowed, continued. "Palmieri held him under the water, right off Pier 9, held him down until he stopped fighting. They weighted his pockets with scrap iron, dumped him north of the bridge, figured the current would carry him downstream, and the body would look like a mugging. Walsh kept his wallet as a trophy. Sick bastard probably still has it." The Donnellys stood in silence, processing confession as evidence and execution order simultaneously. Eddie Palmieri sat 3 chairs away, his face gray in the lantern light. Theodore Walsh had already vomited twice from the seconal, and fear he was slumped in his seat, barely conscious, unaware that Burke had just sentenced him to concrete and darkness. "Where are the documents now?" Thomas Sr. asked. "Burned them myself," Burke said. "At the Union Hall. July 2nd. Same day we got your invitations. Rizzo said we had to destroy any evidence before this retreat happened, just in case. We didn't know we thought this was legitimate. Legitimate men Don't drown easy. Michael tied the concrete bags to Burke's waist with extra rope, making sure the knots would hold. You ordered the killing? I gave Mazzoli permission to handle it however he thought best. I didn't. You ordered it, Michael repeated. Say it plain. Burke's shoulders sagged. I ordered it. They didn't waste a burlap sack on him. Let him see the water coming. Let him watch the gangplank extend. Watch the Mississippi wait below like an open grave. Burke walked on trembling legs, making it 4 steps before his nerve broke completely. He tried to turn back, but Patrick was behind him, blocking the way. Keep walking, or I push you from here. Your choice. Burke chose to walk. 7 steps, 8. He paused at the end, looking down at water he couldn't see in the darkness, only hear. I'm sorry, he whispered. Tell Sean, Thomas said. The splash was smaller this time, almost polite. The river swallowed Burke without ceremony, concrete pulling him into depths where apologies meant nothing and sorry came too late. 7 down, 4 remaining. Eddie Palmieri was next, the man who'd held Sean underwater. The Donnellys didn't ask him questions. His guilt had already been confessed by Burke. They simply tied the weights and fitted the burlap sack, while Palmieri cursed in Italian and English, his voice hoarse with rage and terror. You're all going to hell for this, he snarled. All of you. Burning forever. Save us a seat, James said, and pushed. Theodore Walsh Sean's actual killer, according to Burke's testimony, never made it to the gangplank. The combination of seconal, alcohol, and pure fear stopped his heart at 10:28 p.m. He slumped in his chair, eyes open, mouth slack. Thomas checked for a pulse, found nothing, and nodded to his sons. They weighted Walsh's corpse the same as the others and rolled him over the side without ceremony. Dead or alive, the river took them all the same. 8 bodies in the Mississippi. 3 men left. Anthony Rizzo, the dock superintendent who'd approved the whole scheme, sat watching his colleagues disappear with the detached expression of a man in shock. When Patrick approached with the concrete bags, Rizzo didn't resist, didn't speak, just stood mechanically and let them tie the weights, pull the burlap sack over his head, guide him toward the gangplank. He walked all 9 steps without hesitation, reaching the end and simply stepping off like a man boarding a bus. The splash was almost anticlimactic. 9. That left Samuel Morton and Dennis Clark, the grain inspectors who'd been paid to ignore the theft, who'd certified weights they knew were fraudulent, who'd signed documents that gave the dock boss's crimes a veneer of legitimacy. Neither man had touched Sean. Neither had ordered his death. But their complicity had made the whole operation possible, and complicity was guilt enough. Morton begged, offered money, said he had $20,000 in a safe deposit box, offered to sign over his house, his car, anything. I was just doing what they told me, he pleaded. I never hurt anyone. I just signed papers. Sean was just asking questions, Michael replied. Guess which one of you is still breathing. Morton's walk was pitiful, stumbling, weeping, begging God and the Donnellys for mercy that had already been calculated and found insufficient. He made it 6 steps before his legs quit. James Donnelly picked him up bodily and threw him the final 3 feet. The river accepted the delivery. 10. Dennis Clark was the last. He'd gone silent an hour ago, retreating into some interior space where terror couldn't follow. When they approached him, he looked up with eyes that had already left his body. I have a daughter, he said quietly. She's 8. Will you tell her? No, Thomas Sr. interrupted. We're not your priests. We're not your messengers. Whatever you want said, you should have said it before you helped steal from honest men and cover up murder. Clark nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. They weighted him, bagged him, walked him to the edge. He stepped onto the gangplank without being pushed, walked all 9 steps with the steady pace of a man who'd made peace with something, and let himself fall. 11 men. The deck was empty now, except for folding chairs and silence. The barge rocked gently in the current, alone in the darkness, Somewhere downstream, bodies were sinking into silt, settling into the river bottom where catfish and current would erase them slowly, transforming thieves into river mud and mystery. The Donnellys stood together at the rail, not speaking, watching water that revealed nothing. They'd planned this for weeks, but planning and doing were different countries. The crossing left marks. But the night wasn't over. They still had to clean the barge, dispose of the evidence, and get back to Pier 17 without raising questions. And somewhere in street, Louis, 11 families, were waiting for men who would never come home. The hard part was finished. The dangerous part was just beginning. The deck smelled like copper and fear when Michael Donnelly opened the first bottle of industrial bleach at 10:53 p.m. The chemical smell sharp enough to cut through the river's rot. Cleaning a murder scene is harder than committing the murder, especially when that scene is a barge that has to return to a public dock looking like nothing more sinister than a failed fishing trip. The Donnelly brothers worked in systematic silence, the kind of quiet that comes from men who've crossed a line and are now calculating how far the other side extends. Patrick gathered the folding chairs, wiping down each one with rags soaked in bleach and river water, erasing fingerprints and DNA that wouldn't be relevant for decades, but would matter eventually. James collected 11 glasses, some half full, some empty, all evidence of drinks spiked with Saconal. He smashed them against the deck's metal edge, swept the fragments into burlap sacks, weighted the sacks with leftover concrete mix, and heaved them into the current. Evidence sinks like men when properly weighted. Thomas Sr. stood at the stern with the ledger he'd brought, the same yellow legal pad where he'd first written 11 names in the hours after Sean's death. He tore out the pages one by one, touching a lighter to each sheet, watching names curl into ash. Vincent Carbone, Frank Mazzoli, Donald Burke. The paper burned quick and orange, transforming condemnation into smoke that the river wind scattered across water, already erasing bigger sins. The gangplank posed a problem. Its boards were scuffed from desperate feet, stained with river water and possibly blood where men had scraped their shoes fighting for balance they'd never find. Michael dismantled it plank by plank, scrubbing each board with steel wool until the wood looked old and weathered rather than recently homicidal. They'd reinstall it before docking a fishing barge needed a gangplank, but it needed one that told no stories. By 11:37 p.m., the barge looked ordinary. Not clean, exactly too much cleanliness would raise its own questions, but worn, used, the deck of a vessel where nothing more interesting had happened than failed attempts to catch catfish and drink away the heat. The body count was complete. The evidence was dispersed. Now came the harder test, returning to civilization and pretending to be the same men who'd left it 4 hours earlier. James took the pilot house, starting the engine with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years navigating the Mississippi's moods. The barge turned north, fighting current, heading back toward street. Louis and the questions that would start tomorrow when 11 men failed to come home. The running lights stayed dark until they reached the industrial zone's southern edge. No sense advertising their presence until proximity made darkness more suspicious than light. At 11:52 p.m., they passed a police patrol boat heading south. Michael stood on deck in plain view, waving casually at the officers who waved back with the bored indifference of men ending a quiet shift. The patrol log would note a barge returning north, unremarkable, forgettable. From St. Louis River Patrol records, July 19, 1963. 11:53 p.m. northbound grain barge, no registration visible. Advised they were returning from recreational fishing. Appeared in order. No action taken. The dock at Pier 17 was dark when they arrived at 12:17 a.m., technically July 20th now, a new day that would bring new problems. Patrick tied off the mooring lines while James killed the engine. The neighborhood around the pier was industrial, deserted at this hour except for a night watchman at the grain elevator 3 blocks north. He'd noted their departure at 6:30 p.m. Now he'd note their return after midnight. Routine. Expected. A barge chartered for an evening that ran long because the fish weren't biting and the bourbon was. They left the barge exactly as renters should: folding chairs stacked, fishing equipment stored, deck reasonably tidy. The charter company would inspect it tomorrow, find nothing alarming, and rent it to the next group who needed floating space for legitimate or illegitimate purposes. The Mississippi dissolved evidence better than bleach dissolved blood. Walking to Thomas Sr.'s truck, Michael felt the weight of what they'd done settle across his shoulders like wet concrete. 11 men, 11 murders, no 11 executions. The distinction mattered in his head, even if the law would see no difference. They'd killed thieves and murderers, men who'd stolen livelihoods and taken Sean's life. Justice, not murder. He repeated this to himself, needed to believe it. The truck's interior smelled like old tobacco and diesel fuel, familiar and grounding. Thomas drove slowly through empty streets, obeying every traffic light, staying 5 miles below the speed limit. Getting pulled over now would be catastrophic, not because they carried evidence, but because police would remember them, place them near the river on the night 11 men vanished. "What do we say when they start asking questions?" Patrick said from the back seat, speaking the fear they'd all been avoiding. "The truth," Thomas replied. "We chartered a barge for a labor meeting. They never showed up. We waited until 8 p.m., figured they'd changed their minds, went fishing instead. Came back late because we were enjoying the evening. Simple, consistent, impossible to disprove." "And when the bodies surface?" James asked. "If they surface," Thomas corrected. 60 pounds of concrete in silt bottom, current strong enough to carry them to the Gulf. Those men might stay down forever. But if they don't, if the river gives them back, what's the connection to us? 11 dock workers dead in the Mississippi? The police will look at mob hits, gambling debts, union politics gone violent. They won't look at grain haulers unless someone talks. The Donnelly yard appeared ahead, its chain link fence and rusted trucks exactly as they'd left them. Home. Or what home looked like after you'd turned yourself into something home couldn't quite recognize anymore. They parked, sat in silence, engine ticking as it cooled. "We don't talk about this," Thomas said finally. "Not to wives, not to priests, not to each other, except when absolutely necessary. What happened tonight happened. And now it's finished. Tomorrow we go back to hauling grain on scales that better read true, or someone else is going to learn what the Mississippi does to liars." They went to their separate homes, separate beds, separate attempts at sleep. None of them managed it. Michael stared at his ceiling, seeing water and burlap sacks. Patrick paced his kitchen, drinking coffee until dawn. James sat on his porch, watching stars that seemed dimmer than they had yesterday. Thomas Sr. knelt beside his bed and tried to pray, but found God had moved to a different address, somewhere men who drowned 11 people couldn't reach. Morning came anyway. The sun rose over Street Lewis, indifferent to what the night had swallowed. The newspaper hit doorsteps. Coffee percolated. The city woke to Friday, July 20th, 1963, and absolutely nothing seemed different. But by noon, something would be very different, because Vincent Carbone's wife had called the police to report her husband missing. The Street Louis Police Department's missing persons desk smelled like burnt coffee and cigarette ash when Detective Robert Harrigan took the 7th frantic call before noon on July 20th, 1963. 7 wives, 7 missing husbands, all last seen heading to the same labor meeting that apparently never happened, or happened in ways the Mississippi wasn't ready to confess. Detective Harrigan sat at his desk in the 3rd Precinct, receiver pressed to his ear, listening to Mrs. Vincent Carbone describe her husband's failure to return from what should have been a routine evening meeting. He said it was mandatory. She insisted, her voice tight with worry that hadn't yet transformed into grief. Some kind of labor retreat on a barge. He was supposed to be home by midnight. It's almost noon, and I haven't heard anything. Harrigan took notes with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd heard variations of this story 6 times already. Same meeting, same barge, same midnight return that never happened. He'd already dispatched officers to Pier 17 to investigate. Now the calls kept coming. Mrs. Mazzoli, Mrs. Burke, Mrs. Rizzo, each reporting an identical disappearance, each describing the same invitation to resolve dock disputes through conversation and fishing. By 1:15 p.m., the pattern was too consistent to ignore. 11 men, all dock supervisors, union officials, or grain inspectors, had vanished simultaneously after boarding a chartered barge that returned empty except for the crew, who claimed their passengers never showed up. The Donnelly brothers sat in the 3rd Precinct's interview room at 2:30 p.m., answering questions with the practiced calm of men who'd rehearsed their lies until they sounded like truth. Thomas Sr. explained the situation to Harrigan and his partner, Detective Frank Morris, with just enough confusion in his voice to seem authentic. "We got invitations same as everyone else," Thomas said, sliding the typed letter across the scarred table. "Labor management retreat. 6 p.m. departure from Pier 17. We showed up on time. Waited until 8. Nobody came. Figured they'd changed their minds or the whole thing was a miscommunication. We'd already paid for the charter, so we went fishing instead. Came back around midnight." "And you didn't think to report 11 missing persons?" Morris asked, skepticism sharp in his voice. "Missing from what?" Michael Donnelly replied. "Far as we knew, they just didn't show up to a meeting. Happens all the time with dock bosses. They promise to talk, then don't. We figured they were making a point, showing us they didn't have to negotiate on our terms." Harrigan studied the invitation. The signature looked like Vincent Carbone's, but Carbone's wife swore her husband never organized any such meeting. "Who chartered the barge?" "Company called Midwest Management Solutions," Patrick said. "At least that's what the invoice showed. We just went where the invitation told us." Midwest Management Solutions existed only on paper, another shell company the Donnellys had created using Raymond Hollis's techniques. The charter payment had been cash, handed to a rental agent in Alton, Illinois, who'd barely glanced at the paperwork. By the time police tracked the company, they'd find nothing but a closed post office box and dissolved incorporation papers. The interview lasted 90 minutes. The Donnellys never wavered, never contradicted each other, never offered more information than asked. They were grain haulers who'd been stood up for a meeting. Nothing more, nothing suspicious, just men confused about why dock bosses who'd agreed to talk had failed to appear. Harrigan had no evidence to hold them, no witnesses to contradict their story, no bodies to prove a crime had occurred at all. Murder without corpses is just theory. The investigation expanded rapidly. River Patrol dragged sections of the Mississippi between Pier 17 and the industrial zone where the barge had been spotted. They found nothing, not bodies, not clothing, not even the personal effects 11 men should have been carrying. The water stayed silent, hoarding its secrets like a miser guards gold. Theories multiplied faster than evidence. The most popular involved organized crime. Vincent Carbone and Frank Mazzoli both had known connections to union racketeering. Maybe they'd crossed the wrong people, stolen from the wrong accounts. A mass mob hit made sense to detectives who'd seen what happened when syndicate patience ran out. 11 bodies in the river sounded exactly like a message from men who settled disputes with concrete and current. From the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, July 23, 1963. Police investigate possible mob connection in disappearance of 11 dock workers. Anonymous sources suggest victims may have been skimming union funds. FBI considering federal racketeering probe. The gambling debt theory came next. Several of the missing men were known to frequent illegal card games in East St. Louis. Theodore Walsh owed money to bookies. Eddie Palmieri had been spotted at underground poker rooms where stakes ran high and losers sometimes vanished. Maybe they'd accumulated collective debts that required collective payment. Nobody looked at the Donnellys. Why would they? Grain haulers weren't criminals. They were victims of the same dock corruption everyone knew existed, but nobody could prove. If anything, the Donnellys should be celebrating these disappearances with the dock bosses gone. Maybe the scales would finally read honest. And that's exactly what happened. The new weighmaster assigned to the St. Louis docks was a retired Army quartermaster named Harold Jensen, who ran his operation with military precision. The scales were recalibrated. The weight ticket system was overhauled. Suddenly, impossibly, Donnelly and Sons trucks that had been reading light for years started showing their true tonnage. 4 tons loaded meant 4 tons recorded. No more mysterious shrinkage, no more missing grain. The family's August income jumped 32% without hauling a single additional load. On August 14, 1963, Thomas Sr. stood in the Donnelly yard, watching his sons load a truck bound for the docks. The International Harvester coughed blue smoke, same as always, but the weight ticket that came back that afternoon showed exactly what they'd loaded. Truth, measured in pounds and ounces, returned to the street. Louis waterfront, like a ghost haunting its old territory. Michael noticed his father standing at the office window, staring at the ticket with an expression that mixed satisfaction and something darker. Was it worth it? Michael asked quietly, joining him. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Outside, rain had started falling, the first real storm since July 19th, washing the yard's dust into muddy rivers that ran toward the street. "Sean's still dead," Thomas said finally. "Those 11 men being dead doesn't bring him back, but the scale reads true now. And sometimes, that's the only justice honest men get. The bodies never surfaced." Weeks became months. Fall turned to winter. The Mississippi froze at its edges, ice forming like scar tissue over water that held 11 secrets in its silt. Families held memorial services without caskets. Insurance companies argued about death certificates issued without bodies. The FBI opened and closed its investigation, finding corruption but no concrete evidence of organized crime involvement. The case went cold like the river. But on the Donnelly yard, a newly calibrated scale continued reading true, its needle swinging to honest numbers for the first time in a decade. And late at night, when the yard was empty and darkness settled thick as river water, sometimes Thomas Sr. would stand beside that scale and wonder if 11 lives balanced against one cousin and a decade of theft. The math never quite worked, but the scale kept reading true. 43 years later, in a hospice room that smelled like antiseptic and approaching endings, Michael Donnelly told his granddaughter a story about 11 men and a river that never gave them back. Some confessions wait until the confessor has nothing left to lose, which is exactly when truth becomes most dangerous and most necessary. The year was 2006. Michael was 81 years old, his body failing in the methodical way bodies do when they've carried decades of weight that scales can't measure. His granddaughter, Sarah, had come to sit with him during his final weeks, reading newspapers and making small talk, until one afternoon she mentioned an article about new sonar technology mapping the Mississippi riverbed near Street. "Louis, they're finding all kinds of things down there," she said. "Old barges, car frames, even human remains from decades ago. They think some might date back to the 60s. Michael's hand tightened on the bedrail. "Some things should stay buried." Sarah set down the paper, studying his face. "Grandpa, what aren't you telling me? The confession took 3 hours." Michael spoke slowly, carefully, pausing when nurses checked vitals or adjusted IV drips. He told her about Sean's murder, about the rigged scales, about invitations written with death already decided, about 11 men walking a gangplank into Mississippi darkness, about his father burning names in a ledger while bodies sank into silt. "We were never caught?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Caught requires evidence," Michael replied. "The river kept our secret better than we could have kept it ourselves. But secrets have weight that accumulates over time, compounding like interest on unpaid debts." Thomas Sr. had died in 1987 after a stroke that left him speechless for his final 6 months. Unable to confess, unable to explain, locked inside a body that had become its own kind of river bottom. Patrick had drunk himself to death by 1994. his liver failing from decades of whiskey consumed to drown memories that wouldn't stay submerged. James had lasted until 2001, dying in his sleep with his wife beside him, taking his silence to whatever waited beyond the Mississippi's final current. Only Michael remained. And soon, he wouldn't. "Did you regret it?" Sarah asked. Michael stared at the ceiling, seeing water instead of acoustic tile. "Every single day. And not once. Both things true at the same time." He turned to look at her. Sean was family. Those men killed him and would have kept stealing until there was nothing left to take. We did what the law wouldn't, but doing it changed us into something we couldn't change back. The hospice room grew quiet, except for machines measuring heartbeats and breaths, scales of a different kind, weighing out what remained of a life that had carried 11 deaths across 43 years. "Are you going to tell anyone?" Michael asked. Sarah shook her head. "Who would believe it? And what would it accomplish except hurting our family?" "Then you carry it now," Michael said. "That's how these things work. Stories get passed down like debts, and someone always has to pay the interest." He died 3 days later, on October 9th, 2006. The obituary listed him as a retired grain hauler, devoted father and grandfather, pillar of the St. Louis community. No mention of barges or concrete or men who vanished into water that kept its promises better than people kept theirs. But Sarah kept the story. She researched the 1963 disappearances, finding old newspaper articles that described 11 missing dock workers, mob theories, gambling debts, investigations that led nowhere. She found death certificates issued 7 years after the disappearances, declaring men legally dead without bodies, without closure, without truth. She also found something else: records showing that in the weeks after the vanishings, the St. Louis dock waymasters implemented comprehensive scale reforms, new calibration protocols, external audits, oversight committees. The systematic theft that had plagued grain haulers for years simply stopped, replaced by measured honesty that industry veterans called miraculous. 11 murders had purchased institutional reform. The math was grotesque, but the scales finally read true. In 2019, the Army Corps of Engineers conducted sonar mapping of the Mississippi riverbed as part of a navigation improvement project. Their scans revealed numerous anomalies in the silt between St. Louis and the industrial zone, dense objects that imaging suggested might be human remains weighted with concrete or metal. The Corps reported their findings to local authorities, who cross-referenced the locations with historical missing persons cases. Several anomalies matched the approximate area where 11 dock workers had vanished in July of 1963. The case was briefly reopened, then quietly closed again when cost-benefit analysis determined that recovering remains from 30 feet of river silt after 56 years would be prohibitively expensive and forensically unrewarding. The Mississippi keeps what it's given. Sarah Donnelly still lives in St. Louis, working as a hospital administrator, carrying her grandfather's confession like ballast she can't quite set down. Sometimes she drives past the old Donnelly & Sons yard, long since sold, now a logistics company with modern trucks and digital scales that measure loads to the tenth of a pound. Perfect accuracy, perfect truth, built on a foundation of 11 bodies that may or may not still be sleeping in river silt. Their concrete anchors holding them to the bottom, while catfish navigate around bones that might be driftwood or might be dock bosses who learned that some debts get paid in water and silence. The Donnellys are gone now, all of them, but the scales still read true. And on quiet nights near Pier 17, old-timers claim you can sometimes hear sounds carried on the river wind, something between a splash and a scream, between confession and drowning, between justice and murder. The sound of 11 men learning that the Mississippi settles accounts better than any court, and that some weights can never be balanced, only buried. Dock workers still check their scales obsessively, calibrating and recalibrating, making sure the numbers match reality because they've heard the stories. passed down through generations like warnings wrapped in legend. Somewhere beneath the brown water, 11 men are still waiting to collect on weight that was stolen from the wrong family. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.